All right, hello everybody. Today I've got something that, well, it might take a little while to get through, but let's see. So, what I want to talk about today is a technique for deepening your writing. It's very easy these days to get into a habit of shallow writing, right? Shallow writing can flow and sound very good, and not everything necessarily must or should be some kind of crazy deep dive either. We have, microblogging and stuff like that these days, which encourages people to kind of get out short, statements of opinion or short statements of opinion backed up by relatively short facts. And it's very easy based on this kind of, incentive structure to get into a trap, not a trap necessarily, but to get into a situation where you find yourself wanting to write more deeply about things and having a little trouble doing so. If you're writing about something about the seat, and you're working just kind of from the seat of your pants as well, this is pretty common in fiction, or even if you've, just gotten kind of too much into the habit of writing these very, very small little things about topics, you might find something that you're writing is either by your own, what would you call it? By your own evaluation is shallow, or somebody might tell you that it's shallow to your face. Writing deeply about things in an easy and natural way requires a ton of pre-existing knowledge. You have to have in order to get deep writing, from the first go, it's, you usually either need to have a long process of outlining so that you know exactly what you're going to talk about, or you need to have really good encyclopedic knowledge of the topic that you're talking about, or the world that you're building, or whatever. And it may be that you don't have those things. You're writing something to kind of help understand your own thoughts about it and to give you a reason to kind of look into it. In that case, it's going to be very hard for you to write something deep to begin with. But using this technique, you may be able to get a little bit deeper, or, to the desired level of depth that you hope to reach. And it's important to make sure to remember that depth and length are not necessarily the same thing. It's very easy to go off on tangents and add a lot of length, but mistake that and mistake that as depth. So let's talk about a method to help target interesting and meaningful places and topics to add depth on, and to help figure out where to put the additional details. You may already do a form of this, right? Like you may listen to this presentation and say, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I do already. But generally speaking, you might not be fully aware of what you're doing, and it can help sometimes, even for kind of like an intuitive technique that you're intuitively using, to formalize it so you can understand it better, and then you can apply it more efficiently, right? So here's the technique, and it's really simple, and it's probably something you already kind of sort of do, but it's basically this. Once you've written something, you've got it in front of you, read through it again, ask a bunch of questions, and answer the best ones. So there are a lot of places where this could be useful. This can be useful in fiction. It can be useful in nonfiction. It can be useful in informational writing. It can be useful in persuasive writing. It can be useful in world building. It can be useful in character development. So let's split this up into two parts. Let's start with fiction. In fiction, what are we going to do? What are we going to ask questions about? Well, there's all kinds of things. I'm not going to try to list all of them, but I'll list a few, right? The questions that you ask, you have a piece of fiction that you wrote in front of your face, you're reading over it, and you might ask questions about the setting, about character traits or the character appearances in the setting, perceptions, interests, motivations of characters, details about objects, technology, information about culture. I'm being very broad here deliberately because there's a huge, an unlimited list of things that you could possibly ask questions about. I'm just trying to kind of break them down into a few different useful categories. And then the question is, well, what are the best ones? Well, that can be a little bit harder to determine, and a way to help determine which questions are the best ones is to think like a reader and say, what would the reader, what questions would a reader who's read this for the first time, who wasn't me, wasn't the writer, would ask about these kinds of things. Again, in fiction, you might find that a reader you might think about a reader wanting more details about a character. You might think about a reader wanting you to paint a slightly more detailed picture of the setting, things like that. For example, in the book that I'm currently writing, the characters in that book visit a resort planet. And that resort planet, I mentioned a few reasons why it is a resort planet, but one thing that I did as I was looking over the chapter where they actually go down to the surface and walk around is, what would these characters notice? What would they say about it? What might they say to each other about it? So, one example of one question, and these questions kind of tree out. You need to make sure that you don't ask a bunch of questions at the very start of the thing and then nothing for the rest of it. Generally speaking, it helps to go through a document, the whole thing, and say question here, question here, question here, question here, question here, and try to spread them out a little bit sometimes. I mean, there's going to be pacing issues, right, where you're going to want to say, well, this is a good place to answer some questions because this is a gentle part of the pace. I might have questions in this action scene, but I should try to work them in earlier or later than the action scene so as not to damage the pace. For instance, you might want to describe that there might be a guy who's robbing some people, right? And you might decide that you want to write some details about the gun he's using. Well, it would be a little strange for someone to go into a 2-paragraph description of the gun while they're having it pointed at them. But what you could do, for instance, is you could ask the question there. The writing is something like, well, he pointed his gun at such and such, and you're like, oh, what kind of gun? You might ask a question here, but decide to answer it elsewhere in the text. For instance, you could have someone notice, oh, there on his hip there was a holster, and in that holster I saw a gun that was it was a Colt 1911. It had a stainless steel frame. It had wood grips. The hammer was back. It was cocked and locked. Right. You could add a lot of details like that, but the question is, where would you add them? So, again, going back to the thing I was recently writing, they were on this resort planet, and one of the questions that I asked is like, well, what's the wildlife look like on this planet? Can I give an example of the wildlife that might be interesting? And I chose to describe a species of kind of like lizard-like birds, basically, to put it shortly. So I said, okay, this is what I want to describe. I came up with a description for them, kind of pictured them in my head, wrote down what they look like. And then what I did is I asked myself a couple more questions. Number one, where does this belong? Well, I decided that even though I might ask that question, right as they landed, what I actually did is I placed the information while they were walking from point A to point B a little later in the chapter. So whenever you answer one of these questions, a natural question to ask is, where do I put this answer, right? So you got to think about that too. But then I thought further, deeper questions. What does it look like? How do we describe it? Who says what about it? And so I came up with some interesting ideas. I decided that the common name for them was greenies because they have a green, shiny scales on the surface of them, and some of those scales have evolved into modified feathers, basically. And then I said, well, can I add a little bit more to this? Can I add a character detail to this, right? Your questions can have that form too. Can I add this? Can I do this? What happens if I do this? And I decided that, well, one of the characters, Lou, has a tendency to use longer, more highfalutin words. And so I had the main character, the POV character, describe it. And then, he calls the scales or scale-like, feather-type appendages shiny. And then I said, well, what I can do is I can actually add a little side note from the main character about another character. He can say, well, I called them shiny. the word that Lou used was iridescent, right? So what I've done here is number one, I've asked a question about what would they have noticed? What is this resort planet famous for? Well, one of those things is the wildlife. Okay, well, what's the wildlife? What does it look like? Okay, what does the main POV character say about it? How does he describe it? Number two, and then finally, is there anyone that he's with that would ask or that would describe it differently, and can I make that into a character interaction moment? You can see that I've taken something very basic, something that wasn't even there in the first draft, right? And I've added a decent amount of detail about this thing to include, the details of its appearance, placement in the chapter, a character who has a different evaluation of it, and the main POV character's evaluation of that other character's evaluation of it. So you can see that this question thing kind of creates a tree, and you have to prune it carefully, but you can get depth out of things by doing this. So, just an important note that I think would make sense to talk about here is that it's good to, I mentioned this already, but it's good to go through a sizable portion of your text and ask and answer questions somewhat evenly, accounting for pace, rather than inflate one small part of a story. You can very easily get into one of these question trees, and you can fill out like one part of the story or the essay or whatever, and leave the rest of it shallow. So, generally speaking, you're going to want to ask these questions about the whole document and then go back and say, okay, I'll do one here, I'll do one here, I'll do one here, I'll do one here, kind of thing. Just because questions can lead to more questions, it ends up kind of inflating the areas where you decide to go into these answers in detail. So, you need to stop frequently, and you need to reassess if the desired depth has been reached, if you have if you've affected the pace in any negative ways, you need to watch out for that. If you've spent too much time talking about something, then you can kind of prune it back, pare it back, and get to the place where the amount of detail that you want is there. So periodic reevaluation is necessary, but again, this is part of formalizing the technique. So, we've talked about fiction. Let's talk about nonfiction. In nonfiction, this question method can get you from a mere statement of opinion to something as expansive as a persuasive essay or an argument. So imagine that you make a point. Now what you're going to be doing is, instead of talking about like character details, because there aren't any characters, this is nonfiction. I mean, there might be characters, right? Because you might be writing about history, right? And you could say, oh, well, Napoleon did XYZ, he enjoyed ABC, stuff like that. So the same questions can sometimes be applied depending on what your topic is, but one other thing you can do in nonfiction is you can ask questions about points that you're making, even if those points are like pure opinion on your part. Like, we'll get to that in a second. Or what you can do is you can phrase objections to your statement, should they exist, in the form of a question or questions. And here's the trick in nonfiction, right? The best questions, the very best questions, are going to anticipate the reactions of the readers. Have you ever been reading like a persuasive essay or a piece on history or something like that, and you're reading something, and then like a sentence later you're like, well, wait a minute, what about? And then you see the next sentence answers your question. That moment of, oh, the author just read my mind, kind of thing, can be very gripping to a person. If not persuasive necessarily, you could always, read their mind, but get the answer wrong, kind of thing. You have to be careful about that. But it's kind of nice to read something and say, oh, I had this question right now, you kind of raised it, and now you're answering it. That's, assuming that it flows with the rest of the argument, with the rest of the essay, it works really well to kind of keep the reader interested and keep the reader, paying attention, basically. Because what you're doing is you're rewarding them. You're rewarding them for asking that question. You're saying, you're basically saying, if you've ever given a talk, right, and someone asks a question, often people will respond and start their response with, "Oh, that's a very good question," right? I've made fun of that by saying, "That's a very good question. Next question," right? But all joking aside, by saying by answering a question in a written document, what you're basically saying is, "That's a good question. I'm going to provide an answer to that," as opposed to having the reader ask the question and never and have to like kind of puzzle over it, right? It's it's an agreement, sort of, but it's sort of an agreement between the reader and the writer, basically. The writer says, "I believe that you might have this question." The reader says, "Yes, I do have that question," and that agreement helps to kind of keep the reader engaged. So what you can do as a writer of a persuasive essay or something like that is you can try to anticipate the questions that someone might have or the objections that they may have, and then provide answers in a way that flows reasonably. Again, you always have to watch out for like inflating, in the cosmological sense, inflating one chunk of the document over all others, right? So spread things out, watch for pacing. Keep a good feel for that you're not just going off into, because a reader might ask one question and then you answer it, and then what you also do is you answer like a bunch of subsequent questions that the reader wasn't asking, right? You can go into these question trees and you can get really deep into one thing, but oftentimes just that one, "Oh, you read my mind. Here's the answer. Okay, that seems reasonable. Here's a reference maybe to like further depth on that particular topic." And then you move on. You can always choose that, like, "Oh, I was going to write about the Battle of Waterloo, but what I decided that I'm actually going to do is write about this particular movement of a troop formation in the Battle of Waterloo." And you can make an essay that's just on that little thing. You can deep dive into one particular area, but you need to watch out that you don't end up writing an essay that in its completeness spends 30 pages on on this one movement of a troop formation and 1 page on the rest of the whole battle. You may as well get rid of that 1 page on the rest of the whole battle and change the scope of your essay to begin with, right? So watch out for that kind of stuff. But like, I thought maybe a couple of examples might be helpful, right? So here's one from a scientific background. Quantum mechanics is weird. Pretty basic statement of opinion. Doesn't really provide any information. Just like a question of like, well, why is it weird? Well, that's a great question. Why is quantum mechanics weird? There's a variety of different answers you could give to that question. We'll pick one just that I thought of immediately. Well, the weird thing about quantum mechanics is that there really aren't any particles. We're very used to thinking of particles, of objects, right? There's really only, but in quantum mechanics, there really aren't particles per se. There are only wave functions. Well, okay, so what's the obvious question asked there? Well, wait, why are there no particles in quantum mechanics? Well, what we would do is we could show the Schrödinger equation, and we say, well, the Schrödinger equation is what explains the dynamics of things in quantum mechanics, and this Schrödinger equation doesn't have a place for a point particle. What it has a place for is it has a place for some kind of wave function that is extended in space in some way. And therefore everything is kind of some wave function that's extended in space in some way. And well, okay, so let's go into that a little bit deeper. Well, wait, what prevents us from having a point particle and have it be part of the Schrödinger equation? Well, if you a good approximation of a point particle in kind of this, multi-dimensional, or you could even do one-dimensional kind of Schrödinger equation thing here, right? What if we go to like a Gaussian that's really, 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 really tight in space? Okay, that's more reasonable. If we look at, say, a Gaussian in space, then what that thing will naturally do over time, through the Schrödinger's equation, is it will spread out. And so you end up kind of coming to the conclusion that the reason that things take up finite space in quantum mechanics is because they're interacting with other things. And that leads to a whole new set of questions that you could ask. For instance, you could ask, are there any solutions to this equation that don't spread out over time? And surprisingly, the answer is not no. The answer is actually yes. There are things called solitons. And if you plug in an appropriate soliton into an appropriate wave equation, you get something that kind of stays localized, stays tight in space over time. And you might say, well, why don't we have that in quantum mechanics? Why aren't particles just little solitons that move around like billiard balls? And the answer is that, well, a soliton is not just kind of like a random arrangement of wave function. It's a very carefully engineered thing that if object A and object B, both having wave functions that are expanded in some way in space with phases that are not correlated to each other, if thing A bumps into thing B, right, it's very unlikely that the exact requirements that you would need to create a soliton on thing B or on thing A would be satisfied by their conditions, since they're not correlated to each other. And so, generally speaking, these kind of soliton solutions have to be engineered by someone trying to make them with a series of special, careful adjustments of things. And we've done things like solitons in lasers. Like, people have done solitons, soliton laser kind of stuff. And we see these pulses of light, propagating without spreading out like you would expect, and just a random pulse of light to spread out due to diffraction and stuff like that. So we've already gone into this rabbit hole where we're talking about Schrodinger's equation and solitons and interactions and stuff like that, and you can expand that out by asking more questions. But at the same time, we could go in a completely different direction. We could say, well, we're going too deep by talking about solitons. Well, let's talk about, the next question we can ask instead could be, well, what else makes quantum mechanics weird? And then we could go talking about intrinsic spin and things like that, where, like, this particle has angular momentum, or something like angular momentum, something that seems to be able to be added and subtracted like angular momentum, but it doesn't have any structure to have that momentum kind of thing. And we could get into a discussion about spin. This kind of thing works for talking about science. It works for talking about history, too. For instance, we could talk about World War I. Simple question. What started World War I? Well, the answer, assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, right? Well, then we can ask a bunch of other questions. By whom? How did a single assassination result in whole countries that were totally unconnected to either of these people, the assassin or the victim, right? How would that lead to the whole world going to war? Was there anyone trying to stop this? Why did the assassin attack Archduke Ferdinand? There's all kinds of questions that we can ask, and we can go from something very simple, World War I, what started it, to a careful, deep analysis of history simply by going through and asking these questions and answering them, and then having that lead us to new questions, and then choosing our scope to match the desired scope of our essay, of our historical study. So, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here. Again, this technique is probably similar to something that you've already been doing when writing, whether you're writing to, complete a school assignment or something like that. But I think there's some value to taking an intuitive solution to a problem and formalizing a little bit so that you can apply it more efficiently. So my hope is that, by seeing this, you either said, oh, that's a really good idea, I should try that, or you said, oh, that's kind of what I do, but now I kind of understand better what I'm doing when I'm making my writing deeper. So that's what we've got for today. The question technique for deeper writing. It works for fiction, it works for nonfiction, it works for science, it works for history, it works for persuasiveness. You have to worry about things like pacing, you have to worry about things like going too deep into a rabbit hole, but there is definitely something satisfying as a reader to be reading something, to have a question pop up in your head, and have that be the next thing that the author addresses. There's definitely even a rhetorical bonus to doing this and doing it right. That's kind of my thought here. Hopefully, this will help help you formalize this technique a little bit more if you've been using it intuitively, or hopefully it'll give you some new, or help, if you haven't been using this particular technique to deepen your writing, maybe this will give you some ideas on how to implement it yourself. So that's what I got for today. Happy writing, and have a good week. See y'all later.